I started out as more of a storyteller, as a journalist actually, and of course became an activist as well. My family is of course European by way of Latin America, where I was born, in a country that is shared by people like Che Guevara, Argentina, which was an inspiration to me personally, and of course shoes that I can't ever fill. But I guess one of the things that I just wanted to comment on is that when you're looking at the issue of human rights and the right to self-defense, of course, but more importantly, what is rightfully a struggle for liberation for people like myself, the responsibility is much heavier than just being on the sidelines and cheering other people on as they sacrifice themselves for those goals, which I feel deeply and have in fact embodied at various points in my life, in struggle and solidarity both with Black liberation, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans as part of occupations and various things. And when I say Native American occupations, there's no such thing as an indigenous occupation that is unarmed, starting with Alcatraz, and there's many that people don't even know about. And of course, settler colonialism, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about Europeans coming to the Western Hemisphere, starts off with a premise of genocide and a justification of it, and in some cases a glee in that level of unrestrained violence, preceding the issue of slavery in many ways. But these questions are very conjoined as part of the colonial process. We're still looking at that today. I don't think this is a question that's disappeared with history. If anything, it's deepened. And the empire, as it moves throughout the world, I don't know why we can't say the word U.S. imperialism more frequently, is really what we're talking about. I mean, it's more than an empire, it is an imperial empire that takes pride in preemptive violence to justify its own existence and expansion. Having said that, why and how do I intersect with this question of Robert Williams? I never met him. He passed away while I was locked up in a U.S. prison because of political acts, in fact. But not long after getting out and engaging in this serious issue of how do we pass along the history of resistance to new generations, predicated on primary sources, on people's own stories. Obviously, there's very rich history here. One of my oldest friends happened to be living in China at the same time as the Williams family, my friend Lincoln. And one of his jobs was to bring information from the US to other exiles. So he intersects with both John and Robert Jr. in China, because his father was a longtime communist and his stepmother, who happens to be Vicky Garvin, one of the unheralded leaders of the Black liberation struggle, brings them in touch with one another. And upon getting out, we really felt like one of our projects would be to tell the story, which is generally part of the subjugated history of resistance, particularly committed to this question of, you know, who has a right to violence, for what purpose, which I can't address as eloquently as John and Muhammad. But we wanted to tell this story. And because of Lincoln's connection in China, it allowed us to reconnect with Mabel and John. In fact, how I experienced it was through very circuitous and ultimately favorable communications. Lincoln and I ended up in Baldwin, where we were met by John, who, being as security conscious as anybody in a family like this, decided to make sure we were cool before we met Mabel. And so we were in, northern Michigan, and I guess we passed the test. So we were able to sit down in the family home in Baldwin and let Mabel tell the story. Not only her story, but it was a really important affirmation of her role in this history, that we could get her to be the narrative voice and the experiential voice of this history. And part of our project was digging up as much audio material as we could of Rob in order for the two of them to go back and forth. So whose story is it? And typically for myself, I prefer the back seat. It's not my story. But our job is to support the story and affirm the story and to help get it out, because we had the resources to do it. So this starts around 2002 and lasts quite some time. One thing about reaffirmation of the politics and the right to self-defense, I'll just give one example. We did a couple of large events with both John and Mabel in the Bay Area. The first one, I believe it was the first event that we did, was a sit-down in which Mabel Williams and Kathleen Cleaver, both different generations, talk about the role of women in armed self-defense, introduced by Angela Davis, who opens up by her story of growing up in Birmingham. Right. So, powerful stuff. You can see it on our website. You don't have to spend money to see it. Just go check it out. And I think the second, and in that first trip, of course, there were a number of people there, particularly Yuri Kochiyama, who, if you don't know who she is, check it out, joins them at one point. The second trip, when we brought them out, they were joined by Amina and Amiri Baraka. Powerful stuff. Rooms like this size, if not larger, totally packed. It was a church, a Unitarian church, and I believe it was pointed out at one point, I don't know, I believe this is accurate, that Robert was a Unitarian. And so this church, when we approached them to be able to do these events, was overjoyed to be able to talk about armed self-defense in their sanctuary. So for me, this became family, both because of my own political life, but because of it sort of reaffirms that these kinds of stories and this very history has a place today in light of what's going on. And that's a responsibility to be able to pass that along. And it takes other forms for us at the archives, but we don't own the history, but we feel like we need to protect and disseminate it, because this history is subjugated for the most part. It's Charles, thank you very much for bringing us together, whom I just met, and I'm hoping this is a beginning step in a long progression of mutual work. As he says, you know, one of the questions you ask is, do you know who Robert Williams is? Much like I'll pick up a book and look at the index and see if Robert Williams is actually in it. Because if you're going to talk about black liberation in the United States, if you're going to tell an honest story, if that's not there, it's not an honest story. So, a brief word about COINTELPRO, and I don't want to run really long. I hadn't seen the piece of Robert talking about the history, but I know John was interviewed when he was in the Bay Area, and he talked actually in one of the interviews about himself as the son in this family, and both the issue of fear because of death threats and the ways in which his parents protected them at the same time. And that always struck me. You know, for myself, I connect to that both because of my own family and having raised 2 kids in clandestinity by choice, and what that means. You know, similar circumstances, different era, but it really reinforces for me the question of, you can't expect this empire to crumble without sacrifice. If we're serious about really transforming the world, you have to risk something. And that, of course, brings your family into danger. And unless we can bring that kind of commitment to our families, regardless of who they are, you know, whether we're white or black, it's not going to change. The empire will not be brought down because they're going to reach a moral epiphany and change their minds about who has power and how they maintain it. And so that's the conundrum for a movement, because of course holding those politics happens to be illegal. That's where it's at. You know, they're not going to give it up. And if it's going to come down, life will not become more comfortable. Life will actually be very uncomfortable in that process, because we have to give up more of what we have to make that happen. And I'm not saying we should all grab our weapons and go toe-to-toe with a local cop or something. But I'm saying that this phenomenon, when it happens, when we see it, is not, just as John said about John Brown, this is not an act of craziness or insanity. This is a commitment to liberation that we're talking about. And I'll end there. Thank you.